country should prosecute nationals that commit bribery abroad. On this motion we are side government. We're here to tell you why. There is absolutely on grounds of on pure principle there is no duty on a state to prosecute individuals, because prosecution inherently is a function of jurisdiction, and jurisdiction is inherently territorial within the territorial limits of a state. And I'm going to first talk to you about why there is an important, this important argument. This argument is more important and than it is simplistic, because the state has absolutely no duty, ladies and gentlemen, to prosecute individuals who are committing crimes, or particularly the crime of bribery abroad, because the commission of this crime the commission of this crime is inherently problematic. The prosecution of this crime is inherently problematic because there are law and order problems within the territorial jurisdiction of the country which need to be solved, and the state has limited resources and cannot allocate funds to committing to prosecuting crimes abroad. And this is particularly important because the rules of jurisdiction, for instance, are dependent on the efficiency or the easiest forum or the most convenient forum to prosecute crimes. For example, if there are two courts that could concurrently prosecute a crime that has been committed abroad, a court in India and say a court in Sri Lanka, but the crime has been committed abroad, it's most reasonable to prosecute the crime there because all the evidence is there, the witnesses are there, the parties one of the parties to this transaction of bribery is in Sri Lanka, and therefore it makes sense to commit the prosecution of this crime to the state of Sri Lanka. And that is the most important argument we think, because it is highly inconvenient and impracticable to expect the state to prosecute crimes that have occurred abroad, where all the materials required for prosecution are abroad, and the cost is prohibitively high to import all of this material and all these witnesses, and there is no purpose for doing so. They have to come and establish why there is this overwhelming need of law and order situation, of overwhelming need that is similar to an overwhelming need of law and order problems that occur within the territorial jurisdiction of a state. We don't see the need being the same, and in fact we think there are certain benefits that accrue to a state. For instance, when corporations and what they would be arguing is essentially going to lead to a situation where American business corporations are there all over the world, in Latin America, in Europe, in Central Africa, and you're going to have to, so they would expect the American government to go after all crimes committed by American corporations abroad, and that's highly impracticable to expect these people to do this. And we tell you that the state has therefore no duty, and there's no need in the first place. No, because there are problems like trade deficit and law and order problems within the state of America which need to be prioritized way over than the laws. There is some alleged act of bribery that has occurred abroad, which might not even be illegal in that country, right? And I'm going to talk to you about the idea. But before that, we think that there is a large benefit that accrues directly to American shareholders, for instance, in these business corporations. Because if they're receiving a benefit as a result of this act, there's no reason why the state shouldn't protect its own interests and the interests of its own citizens, right? Having said that, like for instance, if you have, if Budweiser were to start business in Saudi Arabia and it is prohibitively expensive, or that their state as a mandate does not particularly endorse alcohol, and there's very limited entry options available, and if they pay a bribe to get to establish a business there, it's the American shareholders who are making money, and there's no reason for them to not be doing this, right? Having said that, let's talk about the necessity of bribing. There are certain market structures where it is almost impossible to start a business without actually bribing public officials. It has been internalized into the incentive structures of public officials, and in large number of cases, particularly in cases like India, in cases like China, it's almost customary to bribe public officials. And the state itself, China itself acquiesces this conduct, and they don't take the conduct as seriously as you want them to be taking, right? So America would be taking the problem of bribery in China more seriously than China takes the problem of bribery in China, which is a slightly retarded standard to hold everybody to this objective. And that's precisely why you have different laws. For example, you have prostitution legal in some states and it's not legal in other states, and you can't prosecute individuals for actions that have been committed abroad when that action has been either de facto acquiesced by the state or de jure, even in law it's not legal, right? Because it's customary and it's in fact lawful under certain cultures to pay what is known as a small facilitation payment, which is just a payment to get something you were entitled to anyway, right? So we think that since there's this large diversity and disparity between the legality of bribery or the amount of state interest that, or the state resources that different states spend in prosecuting and policing bribery, there's a large disparity. There's no reason a state should put an objective standard, and particularly a high one which requires a lot of resources, and spend so much money in policing and prosecuting when it's not when the same degree of seriousness is not attached to this alleged crime outside in that country. Yes, sir.
If Budweiser would go to Saudi Arabia and drive someone to allow for entrance, right? Can this be viewed by Saudi American people as an undue influence of American values in Saudi Arabia?
No, because if there's an overarching legislation in Saudi Arabia. Bribes are usually done to either move. Let's look at what the bribes are not done to change the law itself. You can't say if alcohol is illegal and you bribe them, they'll change the law. It's obviously there are limited entry barriers. They're limited. So if Budweiser is bribing them to put their file on top, to move that file faster, instead of getting their permission in 6 months, they're getting it in 3 months. These things that you bribe people for, under the overarching legislation, there are limited entry options. So we think it's perfectly fair for Budweiser to do that. And then there's the effect of a bribe is not unlimited. You can't undo a legislation. You can obviously speed up the executive, and that's what we're telling you, right? Having said that, what we've told you is that the state has absolutely no positive duty to do this. Then the state need not impose an objective standard to police and an objective standard of seriousness for crimes that are definitely not. There's no common denominator of how seriously these crimes are taken in other places. In fact, we told you in some countries it's even legal and customary to do so, and there is no reason therefore to police them. We told you it's highly impracticable to do this, and it's prohibitively expensive if you want to prosecute crimes in a state where the crimes have occurred in other states, and particularly in a globalized environment where companies have businesses in so many states. It's going to become impossible for countries like America to start policing in every country, every business house of America that has offices outside America. And with that, to close the group.
Thank you, Prime Minister. The leader of opposition.
Fine, we're going to contest this debate on 3 major points, right, which we see as harms to this. What are they? We say, A, this is an active approval of bribery within external nations. Secondly, the idea of perception propaganda. And thirdly, the idea of a singular interface being necessarily better for nations, right? But before all this, let's look at some of the matter that came out from Prime Minister. Firstly, the idea that they're trying to posit that the state has no duty outside its territory is one that we think is fundamentally flawed. And why so, right? We think that the state, in conception, as an institution, was meant to safeguard the rights and values of whatever people that it claims to protect, i.e. its national citizens, and necessarily should go to any and all extents to protect the interests of these individuals, right? We don't think that the fact that these individuals commit actions within or outside the state is particularly relevant to the issue at hand of what the state's important duty is, right? So what do we have to prove to you, therefore, then? That through these activities, the overall safety or preservation of rights, or any and all other phrase you would use, of the individuals of the state should be safeguarded, right? So it isn't enough to say that just because it's outside your country, it's irrelevant initially. Secondarily, this idea that it makes sense to prosecute these people outside because you have limited resources and there are lots of these cases is, if firstly we clash with this, we don't believe this is entirely true. Secondarily, we tell you furthermore that the harms associated with allowing this are too enormous to allow this, right? And we'll get to why that's so later on. The idea of protecting the interests of its citizens is one we'll deal with in our constructive matter, and the idea that if it might not be illegal in these nations is one that we feel is a slight play on semantics, right? We think in any particular nation, bribery is necessarily an illegal task. If you are going to say that in these nations it isn't illegal, right? If you're going to say that no, this is a customary facilitation fee, we feel it's either a customary and therefore legal facilitation fee, to which degree that it is entirely legal and not an issue and not therefore bribery, because bribery is by definition illegal, or necessarily bribery outside the legal framework and structure of these states, which necessitates that it is something that the state does not condone, regardless of whatever cultural confirmation the individuals of that state may take, right? But moving on, what is most important in this debate is the harms that we're going to talk to you that allowing such bribery to take place causes. Firstly, the idea of tacit approval of bribery, right? We tell you firstly, when states say that we are not willing to A, employ the resources to bring these individuals and authority to do so as they are our nationals, we necessarily remove one level of check and balance from allowing individuals to go forward and do these actions, right? Necessarily, when you make a situation that is more conducive for these individuals to commit actions that harm the interests of other states, it necessitates the idea that in principle the state is all right with these individuals going out and doing these things, right? Furthermore, the idea that the state is doing this is is harmful to the idea of international relations between these countries, right? Just one second, I'll complete a few points, I'll get you. The idea that necessarily because you are tacitly approving of this, the idea that other nations will be antagonistic if such things were to happen, right? So further, just one second, right? The idea of perception propaganda ties in very strongly to this point, right? We feel furthermore that if say private citizens of our country, say if we are to take a private citizen of America caught in a country like Iran bribing someone, we think this offers an incredibly powerful fuel for forceful propaganda of the American state by the Iranian state, right? Simply because furthermore, the fact that the country does give tacit approval of the idea in itself is a humongous problem. Secondarily, the problem that any individual of the American state is always inherently associated with the idea of the American state, right? Even if you were to say that this is an American private individual, the idea is always in whatever media reporting, whatever propaganda that the Iranian newspapers will run, will be that an American citizen came into our country with tacit approval of the American government and then chose to bribe individuals of our state legalese, which resulted in harm to our people, right? We feel, and furthermore, that the idea that America allowed this portrays it as either evil or weak, right? Necessarily the idea that either wants to harm you or cannot stop harm to you. Right?
Okay, so I'm not your bodyguard and I'm not protecting you and I'm not stopping anybody if somebody beats you up. Does that mean I'm tacitly approving the idea that you'll be beaten up?
No, right? But this is furthermore on the idea that, for example, if the person who is beating me up is under the control of said individual, right? The idea that if a random person comes and beats me up, this random person has no affiliation to anyone in this room and no one in this room has any control over him. I am not altruistically motivated to send my bodyguard to try and defend this individual. On the other hand, the distinction we need to understand is that all nationals are at a certain level agents of the state who the state can police and control. The idea therefore that you associate this another person is slightly flawed, right? Then on singular interface, and why we think the idea that this protects the interests of citizens is a harmful one, right? We feel that furthermore, because these are individuals and necessarily not state structures, when they act motivated entirely by self-interest, and that too self-interest for their own ends, right? We need to understand this is not always the best case scenario for a state, right? And why is this so? If you look at a situation like weapons trafficking, say for example, India and Pakistan do not want weapons to be traded, and say Indian private citizens enter the state of Pakistan and then sell arms to both sides, because for them, in motive of self-interest, this is necessarily the best case scenario, right? To prolong the war as long as possible and to sell weapons to either side in any such situation. The idea that this is good for the individual but not good for the state is one that we have to consider and is very relevant to this debate. Necessarily the idea that citizens are not individuals who we can control entirely because we give them freedoms and liberties and they're not direct actors of the state in the way say that soldiers or spies are, right? The idea that we cannot give them orders on what to do, and furthermore when they go here and act in ways that might be damaging to the state is a dangerous one. The idea that these individuals may go forth and by virtue of self-interest act in ways that damage the state means that necessarily we want only a singular point of interface between nations, because that is the only way we can police any such relation, right? So, in very quickly summarizing what we talked to you about, we told you, A, that the idea that the state has no duty outside its territory is one based on slightly flawed logic, right? Like, it isn't, the state has no duty to protect the land you're on, it has a duty to protect the citizens. Secondarily, the idea that the state has limited resources, first we clash. Secondly, even if so, we don't feel how this is a somehow overriding concern to the point that it is literally impossible for the state. And if it were to be impossible for the state, it would by definition be a truism. The idea that it makes sense to prosecute those because it spends so many resources must necessarily be clashed with the fact that the harms outweigh the benefits of whatever resource conservation we're talking about, right? And the entire semantic play on what's lawful and what's not lawful and what's facilitation, what's bribery is one that we discard entirely. We tell you that if it's facilitation and it's legal, then there is no bribery in this such situation, and all situations of bribery necessarily act against the relevant state in question. Furthermore, we gave you 3 R's, out of which 2 were tied slightly together by small rope. Of A, the tacit approval of bribery, secondly, the idea of perception propaganda, how perception propaganda is colored by tacit approval of bribery. And lastly, the idea of the singular interface between states is necessary for any such positive relations.
Alright, thank the Leader of Opposition, the Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to be talking about a number of things in the constructive part of my speech, but first let me deal with some of the things they say. Okay. First, I want to point out a really huge concession because they concede that the job of the state is to protect the interests of its own citizens, ladies and gentlemen. That's very, very important because they are making the case that the state should in fact be protecting the interests of other countries' citizens because that's what they're actually trying to enforce. They're trying to enforce the rights of citizens in Iran which have allegedly been violated, and then they're saying that America has some duty to do this. So let's look at the second thing they say. Okay, they clash with this idea that there's a difficulty in resources, and this is inane, ladies and gentlemen. You can't just get away from every argument by saying no, if this was true, it would be a truism. You have to give me an actual reason why arguments aren't true. You can't just rebut arguments by saying if this was true, we could not argue against it, so it's false. Like that's not a response to our argument. Furthermore, let's look at the logic of resources. If witnesses are in Brazil or Sri Lanka or halfway across the world, it's literally not possible to compel these people to appear. If all the documents are there, it's literally impossible to fetch all of them from this place to that place. There's a reason why the duty to prosecute a crime takes place is in the place where the crime is committed, and that's a very obvious reason that you need to that all the resources, all the people connected with the crime, including the accused parties, are there. So it doesn't make any logical sense for the crime to be prosecuted in America. For that matter, why should it, if there's a crime, American company doing a crime in Brazil, by the same logic, why should it not be prosecuted by England? Because England also has a problem with this. We don't understand the logic behind why it should be prosecuted elsewhere. Okay, then they come up with this magnificent semantic point. Okay, that if it's legal, then it's not bribery. Okay, please understand that there's a difference between a concept of a crime and whether that action happens to be legal or not. For example, prostitution is a crime in some places and not a crime in other places. Marital rape is a crime in some places and not a crime in other places. But the fact remains that those concepts still remain the same. So bribery, which is the word in the motion, is still bribery irrespective of whether it's legal somewhere or not legal in that place. The word bribery has a meaning, and that meaning is not connected with whether the activity itself is legal or not, right? Now, what else did they say? Okay, the one constructive argument was this amazing thing about propaganda and tacit acceptance. So on tacit acceptance, this is what they said. They said that you are tacitly accepting it because you are not prosecuting me. So my national has gone there and you are not prosecuting him, so you are tacitly accepting his action. No, that's not the case, ladies and gentlemen. Even if I know the person, for example, if my servant commits some crime and I didn't literally police him, or I literally don't myself go and prosecute him and find all the evidence and collect it and dump it at the police station and along with him wrapped up in a bow tie. That does not mean I'm tacitly supporting whatever crime my servant or my associate or my employee might have committed. If Arghya has committed some kind of crime, that does not mean that Michelin is responsible for prosecuting him or finding evidence and dragging people to get Arghya convicted. That doesn't make any degree of sense, ladies and gentlemen. It's not tacit acceptance for you to do nothing when it was somebody else's duty. And here's the amazing thing, okay, he said Iran will be really angry about this and there will be propaganda in Iran. My first point is, if Iran is so angry about this activity, why aren't they prosecuting it in Iran, ladies and gentlemen? Because here's the question, the point of this debate arises only when the country where this crime takes place is not prosecuting it in the first place, right? If the crime is taking place in that country isn't prosecuting it, clearly they don't have a problem with what's going on, right? So this argument that the country where it is taking place has a problem with it is inherently flawed. If they had a problem, they would be prosecuting this person in the first place. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the same response to this propaganda argument that there will be propaganda in Iran about American citizens. First of all, there's already propaganda. There's already anti-USA propaganda or anti-any propaganda. If people want to come up with propaganda, they will come up with propaganda irrespective of whether we prosecute these people or not. And it's not our duty to engage in this prosecution in the first place. Yeah.
So the action of this individual harm the interests of people back home, you think is justified for them to try?
If it consistently harmed the harmed individuals back home to that degree, there might be an argument for at least weighing the resources, which we still don't think apply. But you need to first prove that you haven't. You said it harms it because of this tacit perception, which I've already debunked. Then you said that it harms the interests of the other nation and the other nation will be hostile towards us. I've debunked that too. You said there will be propaganda. I've debunked that too because propaganda will exist if the nation has a tendency towards propagandizing against whichever country we are debating about. That propaganda will take place irrespective prohibited or not. And what we really fail to understand is that this propaganda is going to take place, why the person would be prosecuted in the first place, which is why it doesn't make sense. And then they came up with another really bizarre argument, okay, which is that weapons trading, and this was the argument, another argument on how it's apparently harming the nation's interest. Listen, let's understand something. Weapons trading is like something which is prohibited under several international treaties and is recognized as wrong under all countries, so you won't need to prosecute them for bribery. If they were engaging in weapons trading, you can just prosecute them for weapons trading, ladies and gentlemen. But where the underlying business itself is legal, you will obviously not. We are saying don't prosecute them for bribery. If somebody has committed a separate offense of genocide and then incidentally it's a genocide, they happen to have bribed somebody, we will prosecute them for the genocide but not for the bribery. Just to make it clear. So our interests are not being compromised at all. Right. Now let's look at some of the more important things in this debate. On our side, we are giving you national interests. Have they responded to that at all? We talked to you at length about the national interests that some of these countries are actually deriving from this kind of activity, ladies and gentlemen. They did not respond to that. We pointed out to the enormous economic benefits which actually accrue to the nation, to the citizens of this nation. Because when Apple does something abroad, Apple has millions of shareholders in America, for instance, and all of those shareholders will benefit if Apple is making profits. So, given that they themselves concede that the duty of the state is only to protect the interests of the nationals of the state, clearly nationals have a huge net benefit because most of the nationals are people who hold shares in these companies. So, there's an obvious benefit that they haven't dealt with at all, right? And secondly, let's look apart from these benefits at the other issues that are involved here, which they haven't rebutted at all, like convenience. They haven't responded at all to our arguments on like convenience and where it is convenient for you to try this particular crime. Furthermore, look at the consequence of America being a global policeman, ladies and gentlemen, literally going all around the world, trying to catch people who are allegedly committing crimes, which are perfectly fine even in those areas. We told you furthermore, this is really important, that this is a major business cost, because in some countries it's literally impossible to transact business without bribes, even in cases where those bribes are entirely illegal. Like for example, in India, to get things you're entitled to, and DD said that, you need to get bribes even if you're entitled to a pollution clearance or a land permit or any of these things. You still need to bribe somebody to get your business done. So in that case, what exactly is wrong about it? Because they haven't explained how it is harming anybody's interest except to assert that you are somehow tacitly accepting this behavior. Right? At this point, they have no case except to make a lot of ill-founded allegations which are not pertinent to this case. Furthermore, they haven't told us how they would actually go about any of these prosecutions, given that you can't compare people to go from one state to another. You can't randomly get all the relevant documents. So there's no way you can do this, there's no way you should do this, you lose from doing it.
Alright, I thank the Deputy Prime Minister, the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Regular minute count this thing. Just a normal, like just show me one, bang and 1 6. Alright, Mr. Speaker, fundamentally what is this debate boiled down to? Right? It's boiled down to whether it is, again, since it is the duty of the state to look after the interests of its citizens, as to whether that duty is maintained best by prosecuting them for paying bribes to foreign officials, right? And here's where we clash with them. We tell you that this idea, right, that they're propagating in terms of why it's okay for you to bribe someone from another country and why we think you should try these people, right? We think that necessarily the actions of these individuals representing a particular country as citizens of that country, right? We think those actions, when they bribe these public officials, we think those are highly dangerous actions that affect the interests of people back home, right? Where not our primary motivation for going into this is not to defend the fundamental rights of Iranian people. If that happens as an added benefit, that's fine, right? But our primary motivation for this is to protect, if it was an America versus Iran thing, is to protect the interests of American citizens back home as well, right? We're not, and that is our primary motivation in order to do this, right? We told you, Mr. Speaker, that we think that when these people go out and bribe public officials, and when these people go out and use bribes to get their work done, we think that has a tangible harm on people back home, right? And how is that so? First of all, we need to understand the concept of a bribe, right? We need to ask ourselves the question as to why this individual needs to bribe in the first place, right? Necessarily, if he needed to bribe in the first place, right, we think there is a reason as to why this particular policy or process or whatever work he wanted done was not being passed, right? We think that when individuals then take it upon themselves to use this bribe as a means for getting their work work done in other countries, right? We think that is a fundamental danger which allows you, opens you up as the host country to lots of attacks from the country wherein the bribe is being committed, right? How do we clarify this thing? We tell you when the PM comes up and gives you the example of Budweiser moving to Saudi Arabia, right? Now, while a bribe, which he comes up and tells you that a bribe will not change the policy towards allowing alcohol in, suddenly it might make it from 6 months, it will make it 3 months, right? And that's something that we still fundamentally think is completely wrong, right? Because the moment it comes out in public knowledge that Budweiser paid public officials in Saudi Arabia to expedite the process of allowing Budweiser into the country, it will be perceived necessarily by the international community as America flexing its muscles and using undue influence to introduce alcohol into Saudi Arabia, and to violate their cultural values in itself.
Okay, so if you are prosecuting Budweiser, isn't that bringing it out into the public light? And if the other country isn't prosecuting it, it's not coming out into the public light.
That's the thing, right? We think that the idea of that they're running with that the other country will not prosecute it only works when bribery is legal in that country, right? We tell you by the very nature of bribery, right? Bribery in itself cannot at any point of time be legal, right? When the PM comes up and talks to you this idea of a facilitation fee, right? We don't think of facilitation fee which is in status quo if it is allowed and it is completely legal to pay someone to get your work done, right? The concept of legalization of bribery itself, then in that itself, paying that individual in itself is not a bribe, right? It is a bribe when you pay someone to get certain work done because that work is not being done and the payment of that bribe in itself is illegal because you are providing that individual monetary incentive to get your work done, right? That is the concept of a bribe. We think this idea and the message that we send out when we try Budweiser back in America, right, is one that will send out a message to Saudi Arabia that is very, very simple, right? That we believe that the actions of this company in bribing public officials in your country was wrong. We don't condone with it and we don't agree with it, right? The problem that will happen if you don't prosecute it is that the international community starts to believe two things, right? One, either they knew about it and did nothing about it, which is very, very dangerous for countries to come to think, or they didn't know about it, and if they didn't know about it, necessarily that portrays them as a very weak government, right? And that's something that is very, very important for this debate. The idea of perceptions in the international community, it's not necessarily, it's about what you appear to be doing, right? It's about what you are seen to be doing. It's about what you are seeing, what actions you're taking, right? This harm that we're telling you, the harm is back to the people at home when there is necessarily when this person is caught and he is brought to trial in that other country, right? When he is brought to trial in that other country, it will come out and necessarily the link that will be made by that country is he is extending foreign influence on the idea of, on the part of the government, right? Another very quick rebuttal is when they come up and tell you that we don't have the resources to do it, it's better than doing that. It's better to try them there, right? We think fundamentally this is a baseless assertion, right? We think the International Court of Justice is an example of the fact that people can bring witnesses, evidence and everything else to a central point that is not in their country, right? We think when Milicevic was tried at The Hague, that by their logic he should have been tried in Serbia instead, right? We tell you that the existence of the ICJ promulgates the idea and allows and is existent of the fact and proves the concept that the resources that they're talking about that you will never be able to get all these people on, we think that's fundamentally a baseless argument, right? When we tell you that the message that you send out is essentially that as an individual, it's okay if you do not punish these people, right? This action of double deterrence is the message that you're sending out to the country where you're bribing, right? Because you're telling that country that, look, this guy walked outside the mandate. We don't allow bribery in our own country. He broke the law by bribery. He broke the concept of bribery. You don't allow bribery in your own country. He broke that law. He subverted existing legal structures and we're punishing him for that, right? We think this idea of deterrence is something that is very, very important, right? We think this concept, when they give you the analogy of master versus servant and it's not his responsibility to go and hand over the servant to the police station, right? We tell you essentially this master-servant relationship and this parallel doesn't apply in the same case in terms of countries, right? There's a fundamental difference between the relationships that a master and a servant has and states and its citizens have, right? The duty of the state is to protect its citizens, right? The limitations on this do not extend to only geographical barriers. We think that the actions of individuals and citizens bribing public officials in other countries necessarily precipitates harms to people back home, right? Necessarily precipitates harms through this existing value of how it allows propaganda, right? How if any other move that you undertake now against this country in an international forum ceases to gain and ceases to maintain any legitimacy whatsoever, because this country will turn around and say that you cannot trust America because they bribe and they use bribes as ways and mediums to get their processes and policies passed, right? And that's something that we have a fundamental problem with. that they're running, right? Or as to why we need a singular interface, and that's something they've not come up and clashed with, right? When we tell you that we need a singular interface for relations and get policies passed between two countries, we think this is something that's very, very important when you connect it with the perception argument, right? When you need this, why do you need this single interface? Because when these individuals act necessarily out of non-altruistic motives and out of their own self-interest, we think there forms a fundamental dichotomy and contradiction between the objectives of this individual and the objectives of the state that the individual is a member of, right? We think when this contradiction comes into play, we think that contradiction allows for great malleability and huge repercussions on the part of the state, right? On all these grounds, we're very proud of it.
Alright, I thank the Deputy Proposition. The government will.
Mr. Speaker, so it all boils down to this, right? They've been trying to come out and convince you today that the only standard for which we should prosecute these people is because at the end of the day, our own interests are getting affected by it in a manner such as that our country and our companies and our individuals are getting a bad name because of their actions, and therefore we should prosecute them. Our answer to that is multi-pronged, and let's start deconstructing it. Number one, when the government of America doesn't prosecute Americans for going to Thailand and indulging in prostitution, it does not mean that we're encouraging prostitution in Thailand, right? Number one, because it isn't within our jurisdiction. Number two, Thai people do not blame Americans for coming to Thailand and dirtying their culture and starting the entire prostitution business, which the government conveniently overlooks, right? So number two, that is not the way public perception goes. Number three, they have had this ludicrous characterization trying to paint bribers as extremely evil characters, and the people who take the bribe are these innocent monkeys who are like duped into taking the bribe, right? No, Mr. Speaker, that's not how what happens. Bribing is a vicious system, that is a systematic problem. The system enforces this upon you and cripples you into such a position where you have to pay a bribe to be effective in business, right? The entry barrier into most of the markets today in developing countries is thwarted by this entire idea of bribery. Because let's understand, companies like Walmart, Mercedes-Benz, Shell cannot enter the Indian market in the first place until they grease the right palms. I know this. I work for a company called Michelin. We spent 2 years establishing a plant that should have taken 6 months because in every stage, from everything from water to electricity to land sanctions to permits, for everything we had to grease palms, right? At the end of the day, what is the option available for Michelin? Either you pay the bribe or you don't do business, and that's as simple as it is. So why in the hell should France prosecute Michelin for pertaining to a system which is prevalent in another country which chooses to rather ignore this problem within its own territories, right? Coming down to this entire idea of jurisdiction, they come out and tell us that we don't believe that Iran will not prosecute this. So then what are we doing? Double prosecution? If Iran is already prosecuting it, why? Like, we'll also prosecute them, Iran will also prosecute them, then we'll have a arm wrestling contest decide who puts him in jail at the end of the day, right? So that's a retarded concept. If they are already being prosecuted in Iran, there is no logic in our way in prosecuting them doubly. And if Iran is not prosecuting them, then that is evidence of the fact that Iran is overlooking and ignoring this particular phenomena that is prevalent within their own borders. Therefore, we have no jurisdiction and no moral right to intervene in this particular situation and help out the Iranians in this particular way. Then they come out and tell us this beautiful idea. We will do them a favor, right? Look, if that is the way law enforcement and criminal justice works to do favors, then we will import their criminals and try them for them, right? To help them out. So America should say, send over Kasab and all these people. We will try them for you. Our justice will do all the work. We will help you out this way. We will get your goodwill, right? That's not how the world works. I don't know why you have this simplistic opinion. But moving on to this next idea, right? They come out and say that these citizens are representing and our actions are misrepresented. Let's understand this. Something Pravar told you very clearly. The countries within which like these propagandist tendencies exist, first of all, these countries will be propagandist either ways, right? Iran doesn't really need a lot of evidence to go out there and say that we should bomb Americans because they are screwing with our culture. These ideas are generally irrational, propaganda exists. But on a second and more logical level, let's understand this, right? In cultures where bribery is prevalent, no one country will be monopolizing the bribery market, right? So in India, there are exposes every day, and American, French, Swedish, and even Indian firms are implicated for bribery. So there is no kind of propagandization that the whole world is conniving against us, because the entire idea of cultural prevalence circumvents
say there is no such thing as resource crunch, and as long, please sit down, sir. As long as like this some magical amounts of money exist, it doesn't cost money. Let's understand how practicality becomes such a huge problem there. Because somebody paid somebody bribe in Swaziland. Now America will say we will fly you down all the witnesses to come and give testimony in America. Then the official there will say no, I want to fly business class. Then you will pay business class tickets because if you don't pay, you can never prosecute these people. So America is now in a fix. It's in a bit of a fix, and America has no real option but to blow a lot of money prosecuting them. To which the answer is ICJ, because this is absolutely ludicrous. They say ICJ is the example to prove that we can prosecute people internationally. Mr. Speaker, ICJ intervenes when 10,000 people are killed, right? And ICJ is convened once in 50,000 years, and it takes another 60,000 years to finish this trial. If we do that with every company, there are 2 billion companies out there involved in corruption. Imagine the number of ICJ scale trials happening, which will take so much time to finish at the end of the day, that all of this will become redundant anyways, right? So their move on all grounds is at best a redundancy. But moving on further, this entire idea that by not punishing something, we are ratifying it, let's understand how this is fallacious, right? And the very idea that just because we can do something about it, we should do something about it, even this is fallacious. Because by that logic, if there are American companies who have billions of dollars in their coffers and children in Africa are dying, we should prosecute them for not helping these children out, right? Because let's see, even in that case, there's a resource surplus, and since we believe in doing good around the world and policing around the world, then we might as well do that. But that doesn't make sense, because the minute you start operating on the principle that we have to enforce our law, let's understand how the concept of criminal justice works in the first place, right? Criminal justice works in a parameter that our citizens are aggrieved, they need some kind of retribution and they need some kind of justice, so we will do justice, right? We will try these people. But when the aggrieved people are beyond our borders, they come to the jurisdiction of another state whose prerogative it is to take care of those people, and they should be the one prosecuting these particular individuals, if at all. But moving on to the final idea, right? They come out and tell us that if Budweiser is going to Saudi Arabia, finally come back to this point from another perspective, right? And then it will give bad name to Americans. Let's understand how this works, right? No American company will go to Saudi Arabia and start a Playboy mansion over there by bribing somebody, right? That is naturally not going to happen because companies are risk averse. They will never go into a transaction which will at the end of the day turn out to be hugely risky and unprofitable for them. So companies enter markets where a market exists in the first place, right? This is the third stage of globalization, where companies from every country, developing countries are going to developed countries to do business, developed countries companies are going to Swaziland and Nicaragua and Burkina Faso to do business, and they are basically tapping markets. So let's understand that as a developed country, when a market, when there are n number of markets available to our companies, which these companies are trying to do business in and bring funds back to our home country, why would we thwart this entire process and cripple them from doing business in places where bribery is the custom and something that people ignore willingly, and that just doesn't make sense on so many levels? And with that, the World Taekwondo Federation is proud to oppose. Thank you so much.
Alright. The opposition with?
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, what we necessarily need to do today is to understand that why is it important to punish somebody who's found bribing outside your jurisdictional or geographical borders. Why is it essential to punish that person in your country? And that is essentially what I'm going to talk to you about. But before that, I'm going to first talk to you about that how bribery is essentially illegal at all points of time, and they cannot come here and tell you that look, sometimes it's a way of law and it's a part of the normal process, because bribery, and I will prove to you that how it essentially is illegal, and doing something illegal needs to be punished, right? And then I'm going to talk to you about like how this sends a message of approval of bribery, and lastly singular interface. But before that, let's talk about bribery, right? And when they come and tell you that look, a lot of times bribery is just a convenience cost, and which is why we should be acceptable about it. But we don't believe it's a convenience cost, right? Because we need to understand, ladies and gentlemen, that if you want to get some work done, and you need A, B, C, D and E processes to go through it, and you know that A would cost you this, B would cost you this, C would cost you this, and D would cost you this, and the overall cost becomes X. Any amount that you have to pay more than this to get your work done essentially becomes a bribe, ladies and gentlemen, and we believe that that is something which is illegal, because if you're already paying the price to get your work done, then you're fulfilling the mandate of getting your work done. Any money that is greater than X that you will have to give essentially becomes a bribe and is illegal, and therefore we believe that when they come certain countries are going to be okay, which is why it's pointless to prosecute people. We don't believe that argument stands, because bribes in itself are illegal, and which is why we believe they should be prosecuted, right? Now let's try to understand that why is it essential that the country whose national does it punishes this person, right? Now when they come and tell you that, look, when they tell you we do not have resources, and let's understand why Arghya used the ICJ example, right? Because we need to understand that what we're telling you is not to take them to ICJ. What we're telling you is the same underlying principle exists. What we're telling you is that the principle exists that you can bring together resources and evidences, you can club them together and have a trial, and that is the principle that Arghya was talking to you about. What we're not telling you is we'll take them to the ICJ. We're telling you that the principle and the possibility of bringing them together exists, and that is what we're talking about. Now let's understand this, ladies and gentlemen. And they come and tell you that you're really punishing people, and that's not what we're talking about. We're telling you that, look, we're telling that if an American citizen commits bribery in Iran, we want him to punish. We want him to be punished the American way, and that is what we're telling you. Let me prove to you this, that how this works for the best interest of the people of America, and which is why America fulfills its mandates of taking care of its citizens. So let's first talk about perception, something that they've absolutely ignored till now. What they believe, they'll come and tell you that, look, propaganda has to happen. So even if you do this, it will still happen. You can understand this, ladies and gentlemen. It's a downside. If propaganda happens, right, why do we need to give it a reason to be exacerbated? Why do we need to increase it to an even larger extent, ladies and gentlemen? Because you need to understand, right, that if in a country propaganda, you know there's a possibility of propaganda, why should we give an added reason for that propaganda to take even greater proportions, right? So let's need to understand that what having proven to you, having established that how bribery is essentially illegal, we need to understand that now if a country goes ahead and does nothing to punish its citizens, if a country goes ahead and does nothing to punish its citizens, the essential message it's sending out is that we're okay if our people do illegal things, we're okay if our people commit bribery, and that is a message we're not okay in sending out, ladies and gentlemen, because we need to understand, right, that when we talk about international relations, we need to understand that we need to understand how this works, and this works on the simple basis of the fact that you cannot let the perception that you cannot let the perception persist of the fact that you're absolutely okay with your citizens doing something illegal on somebody else's soil, because you need to understand that not only are you letting them tinker with your judicial system, you're also creating problems with somebody else's judicial system, and we believe that it's a violation of judicial system on both sides, and which is why this necessarily needs to be dealt with. Now let's talk about the downside. What they come and tell you that, look, and then they come and tell you that, look, companies won't do risky business, and that companies target only a certain section, and that is why companies go, and that's what we're talking about, ladies and gentlemen. Because let's understand this. If I look in terms of a company, right? When a company goes into a country, right? What they come and tell you, they go there because markets already exist, and we agree with it. Markets already exist. But let's understand this. There are stories of that company bribing someone starts leaking. That market then gets then they don't want to jeopardize their market by essentially trying to take bribe. Because let's take the example of Walmart. And why Walmart is at whole in India right now? Because there were reports of Walmart officials bribing people. And that is what we're telling you, ladies and gentlemen, that when a situation like this arises, we believe that it's very, very essential for international relationships to be perceived as a country that is willing to prosecute its people, so that an absolute transparency in international relations can exist. And lastly, we've come and told you about singular interface, right? And we need to understand that when we're letting private companies or individuals operate at a personal level, we're therefore creating a dual interface. And we tell you that a lot of times these individuals might not be acting purely out of self-interest, and therefore there could exist a conflict of interest of that individual and the nation, and that is why we believe that this dual interface needs to be eliminated, and there has to be only a single interface for the interaction between two countries. And so quickly summing up what have I come and told you. We've come and told you that when they come and tell you, sit down, sir. We need to so quickly summing up what have I come and told you. I've come and told you that we need to understand that why is it essential for a country to punish its citizens for doing something wrong, because that country now needs to send out a message which doesn't say that even if our citizen did something illegal, we're okay with it because we're not going to punish him. We want to send out a message saying that as our citizen, he is our responsibility, and because he did something wrong, we will punish him. And that is the message we want to send out. When they come and tell you that lack of resources, and we tell you that, look, the idea behind being that the ramifications of not punishing someone through your own court of justice are so huge Therefore you will have the resources and you will deploy those resources to ensure that the same principle Arghya spoke to you about, that there exists the possibility of bringing resources and evidences together to hold a trial. And lastly, I've talked to you about how it is extremely important to not let this perception persist that we as a country are okay with bribery and we as a country are okay with our individuals doing something illegal, because we believe that as a perception has major ramifications and major consequences on our international relations. And lastly, we've come and told you about that how there needs to exist a single interface for between two countries to interact, because it's not necessary that the interests of these individuals and the countries always go hand in hand. And with that, we wait.
Right, I thank the opposition for speech. The opposition.
Let's deal with 5 points that went through this debate. Firstly, the idea of mandate, which was contested only, I think, in the PM speech, when they came up and said it's outside your territory, therefore outside your jurisdiction. But yeah, after that point, it was dropped fairly quietly by both sides. Then the idea of what exactly is bribery, right? And this is where we're slightly confused. So mainly why? Because bribery by definition would be an illegal transaction of money. For example, if I give someone money to do something that by legal framework they aren't supposed to do, or aren't supposed to do in some set amount of time, etc., right? Necessarily, if this idea is now translated into a facilitation fee, which means that it is legal for me to incentivize work with money, it necessarily means that this is not bribery. Right? Therefore, only cases in which bribery doesn't have legal framework that supports it and encourages it are the only instances where bribery exists at all. Right? We're saying that if such a framework exists, the actions that constitute it are simply facilitation fees. They aren't bribery. On the entire argument of economic costs, right? We contest this on 2 levels. Firstly, the idea that these economic costs are too humongous to handle. Firstly, we offered alternative instances of where similar economic costs have been handled and are being disposed with some amount of efficiency. We gave you the example of the ICJ, which we do feel is fun and useful. But furthermore, the idea that regardless of whatever costs that are attached to this idea, right, in terms of the practical costs, we posit to you that furthermore it's necessary for us to do this for the harms that we prove that still stand, right? And what are these harms? Firstly, the idea of propaganda, which the only clash we received very repeatedly was that these nations are going to go ahead and release propaganda about you or your nation anyway, right? But what is the problem with this argument? We told you furthermore that the idea of giving nations fuel for this propaganda is a bad idea. And why is it a bad idea? Right? Because necessarily when these nations have more fuel for propaganda, or for example, have more real information, in the sense they aren't just saying, oh my god, America is evil, Satan, 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 but more realistically the idea that America has allowed a citizen of its country to enter our nation and manipulate state machinery. The idea that America and American citizens have acted to harm the state's interests is an idea that's harmful for America because it can be more realistically used to create more effective propaganda, right? Similarly, so with the entire argument of tacit approval, they've come here repeatedly and tried to trivialize it by giving you various other analogies of responsibilities and punitions. But the idea that if these individuals are caught and this leads to harm, firstly by way of propaganda, means that in itself there is good reason for the state to make sure that these individuals don't do these things, or the state doesn't condone these things. And secondarily, the idea that the state can choose to either condone or not condone this activity, right? That when the state has the authority to release a statement like, we don't think you should do this and will impose a fine, necessarily it means that by not doing so, it is failing in its mandate ever so slightly, right? Now we aren't saying that it should do this because other nations will feel bad that, oh my god, why aren't they doing this? We're saying they should do this because other nations see that realistically America has either failed in terms of the strength of its power, right? Either America has an advanced intelligence network and is able to tell when all these things are happening and is doing nothing about it, which is a bad thing. Or secondarily, the idea that America doesn't have an advanced intelligence network, is absolutely balls at all this and is generally ineffective state, which is also a dangerous idea to send to the international community, right? Which is what the idea of tackling the rule was essentially. Lastly, the idea of singular interface was essentially that we want to restrict the ability of the nationals or individuals have to inflict harm to the state by virtue of the powers they have outside here. Right? We feel it was necessary to limit this, and there wasn't a lot of things. But anyway, that's it.
Alright, government with that.
Still ready? Right, Mr. Speaker, the interesting thing about the case is that it's a huge one ludicrous point based on 5 or 6 ludicrous assumptions, all of which you would have to agree with to think their case has any chance of succeeding. So let's look at what happened in this debate. We gave you a number of arguments. We gave you an argument of mandate and we gave you a specific argument about the mandate of the state and jurisdiction. They said it was ignored throughout the debate. So I don't know how they think it's a good thing for them that we made an argument and then they ignored it in the entire debate. I don't know why they think that that's good for them, but anyway. So secondly, we told you that it benefits the nation. There was no contestation to this. So we told you that the shareholders of these companies in these countries benefit monetarily to a huge extent, to the extent of billions of dollars. They did not contest this. So this argument stands as well. Then we told you that there's a huge resource crunch. Okay, what was their response to resource crunch? That the ICJ can do it. We pointed out that this is absolutely ludicrous, ladies and gentlemen, because ICJ does this maybe once in 15 years in one case where there's been a genocide where like hundreds and thousands of people have been slaughtered, like for the Bosnia-Serbia massacre or like when the Hutu-Tutsi massacre. So for things like it cannot happen very often on this kind of scale at all. Even though we told you that there are hundreds and thousands of these offences taking place, so that's not a response at all. They've just dropped this argument at all, and they aren't the resources for doing it. Moreover, even if they were the resources, surely the value of this image is not like your entire national budget when you're already $1 trillion in debt. So that's ridiculous. Then, because they didn't have any other responses to that case. So let's look at what they said. Okay. And they basically had this one argument about image and propaganda. So they first said that there'll be propaganda. We said this is ridiculous, there's always propaganda, okay? And then they said, no, you see that these countries will engage in propaganda, and what was the argument for this? The Iranian government will release a press conference saying, America has failed in its duties because an American citizen came to Iran and offered bribes to an Iranian government official who then took those bribes, and we, the Iranian government, haven't prosecuted this. And this is why America, out of all the 15 and 16 countries who have multinational corporations here, is a bad country. Okay, this is so ludicrous that I don't see why anyone would possibly buy this argument. Okay, so as we clearly pointed out, these countries themselves accept this sort of behavior, which is why the debate is arising in the first place. Because if they didn't accept the behavior, they would be prosecuted, and there would be no problem at all here, right? And secondly, even if this wasn't true, like many countries are doing this, and almost every developed country and many undeveloped countries have multinational corporations. So it's impossible to argue that the image of any specific nation could possibly be tarnished. Rather, the only image being tarnished, as we pointed out repeatedly, is the country where the market for this sort of behavior exists in the first place. Right? Now, thirdly, fourthly, they didn't even tangibly quantify the value of their image at all in relation to any of the arguments we are giving. They just said literally image. And if you looked at their approach to this debate, it would seem as if image is one word which are automatically supposed to take as an auto win for them if they establish it. They didn't spend any time anywhere in this debate establishing how much value this image has. What exactly would happen, if Iran didn't like America, which is already the case anyway, because they're saying these countries are first of all engaging in propaganda against you, and then you will lose an image with those countries. It's bizarre beyond belief, ladies and gentlemen. I really can't imagine what they were possibly thinking. Okay. Now, what else is in this? What else did they say in this debate? Okay, they made this bunch of ludicrous arguments which they dropped after we called them out on it. So they made this argument about weapons trading, and then they said that there's weapons trading. We pointed out this is ridiculous, ladies and gentlemen, because if you're doing something else which is accepted to be criminal ancillary to the bribery and is actually harming you, like for example some major thing like weapons trading or slavery or genocide, we can prosecute you for that, but not for the bribery that is involved in this specific case. Other than this, they had pretty much nothing in their debate. So at this point of the debate, we have a side which has given you a reason why you cannot go ahead, which is jurisdiction. They haven't responded to it. As they admit in their reply, they dropped it. We've given you benefits. They agreed with those benefits. We've given you We've given you the specific resource trends. They said that once in 15 years it could be done elsewhere in one instance, and therefore it's okay. That doesn't hold either. Then we've given you a number of rebuttals to everything they've said, and all over their case and prove how all of it's ludicrous. So we win this by something much. Thank you.